It was 4:17 in the morning, May the 25th, 1942, deep under Honolulu. The war against Japan was being fought in a room with no windows. The air tasted like hot dust and cigarette smoke. Vacuum tubes glow orange in steel racks. Morse code hissed and popped over the speakers, while rows of men in khaki shirts hammered typewriter keys, copying endless strings of 5-digit numbers they could not read. Somewhere out in the Pacific, ships were moving, planes were flying, men were dying. In here, it was all just numbers. On the far wall, a huge blackboard was covered in chalk marks. Columns of figures, circles, arrows. It looked less like writing than the wreckage of a language someone had tried to erase. For 6 months, American cryptanalysts had been trying to turn that wreckage back into words. The code was called JN-25B, the main naval cipher of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Tens of thousands of code groups. Then, an extra layer of random numbers is added to the top. To most of the men in that room, it felt less like a code and more like a brick wall. Every hour they failed to break it meant another convoy somewhere in the Pacific sailed blind. Japanese carriers could strike and vanish again into radio silence. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore was gone. The rising sun was spreading across the map, and Admiral Nimitz knew he was almost completely blind to where the next blow would land. One fragment kept appearing in the intercepted traffic, 2 characters, and F. No one knew exactly what AF meant, only that Japanese fleets were converging on it, and that air reconnaissance and refueling plans were being lined up around those 2 letters. Some officers thought it was Midway. Others weren't sure. You do not gamble the last American carriers on a hunch. Most eyes in that room were fixed on tables, charts, or chalkboards. Almost no one watched the woman at the corner desk. She was 24. Her name is Margaret Howard. Officially, she was just clerical staff, hired to retype raw intercepts into clean copies for the real code breakers. She had been told not to think about the numbers, just type them. Keep them neat, do not ask questions. But as the hours turned into weeks, Margaret saw something the experts missed. Certain 5-digit groups kept coming back. Sometimes it's exactly what. Sometimes with a tiny change. On the thin, overused ribbon in her Underwood typewriter, those repetitions left faint ghost images, double-printed shadows of numbers that weren't supposed to repeat at all. She was not on any roster of heroes. She did not wear a codebreaker's badge. Yet in that stale, humming room, the first crack in Japan's unbreakable code was already sitting in front of her, stretched across a strip of inked fabric worth less than $1. And within days, that ribbon would start to decide who lived and who died at a place the Japanese still called only AF. Japan didn't win the early Pacific War with brute force. It won with mathematics. JN-25B wasn't just a cipher. It was a fortress built out of numbers. Each Japanese message began as a 5-digit group taken from a codebook of more than 33,000 entries. Then, an extra layer of random additives was stacked on top, shifting every few days. Even if you stole the codebook, you still stared at gibberish, and for 6 long months, that's exactly what American intelligence had been staring at. Frupac and Melbourne's decoding units intercepted more than 1,000 messages a week, 5,000 digits here, 7,000 there are. But every time analysts thought they had spotted a pattern, the additive tables shifted and shattered it. Math professors, engineers, linguists, all reduced typing, comparing, and crossing out entire nights of work. Commander Joe Rochefort, the eccentric genius running the Honolulu unit, barely left the building. He slept on a cot, surrounded by dictionaries, ashtrays, and cold teacups. One day he spoke in Shakespeare quotes. The next, he muttered about statistical ghosts. None of them changed the fact that JN-25 was beating them. But the codes aren't broken by force. They crack when humans make mistakes. The Japanese system depended on absolute operator discipline. Never reuse an additive, never repeat a sequence, never slip. Humans always slip. Somewhere in the Pacific, maybe on a destroyer off Truk, maybe in a Tokyo radio room, a tired operator reused a tiny piece of the additive key. Two nearly identical messages went out, separated by hours, but encrypted with the same random numbers. That mistake left fingerprints. And the first person to notice those fingerprints wasn't a mathematician. It was Margaret, the one person in the room who wasn't supposed to be thinking at all. Her trained eye for numbers left over from years of bookkeeping saw certain 5-digit groups returning again and again, just slightly too familiar, just slightly too close together. On her worn typewriter ribbon, those shadows lined up like a heartbeat, a rhythm inside chaos. She didn't understand it. Not yet, but she knew one thing: random numbers aren't supposed to be repeated, and if they do, something underneath is leaking through. That tiny leak, barely visible ink on an overused ribbon, would soon become the crack that opened Japan's most trusted code. The moment that changed everything didn't involve a breakthrough machine or a master mathematician. It began with Margaret's quiet persistence. She kept marking repeating groups with tiny pencil dots. She kept saving her used ribbons instead of tossing them. And she kept noticing that certain sequences returned on a fixed rhythm, every 12 lines, every 12 hours, always the same pulse. Lieutenant Davis finally looked at her pages closely. He didn't dismiss her. He didn't laugh. He leaned over the ghosted digits on the ribbon and whispered, "They're reusing additives. And if two messages use the same additive key, you can subtract them. The encryption cancels out. The hidden structure underneath becomes visible." For the first time in 6 months, the impenetrable Japanese code began to bleed. When Rochefort saw the ribbon, he didn't shout. He just exhaled the way a drowning man might after reaching air. He ordered every analyst on shift to start cross-checking those repeating groups. Tables filled with partial additives began to form. Fragments of true codebook words floated to the surface: air group, main body, carrier division. And then one repeated designator started appearing in context: AF, supply orders to AF, reconnaissance over AF, fleet rendezvous west of AF. Hypo suspected AF meant Midway, but Nimitz needed proof. One wrong guess, and the last 3 American carriers could end up defending the wrong patch of ocean. Rochefort proposed a solution so simple it felt reckless. "Let's trick them." Midway sent an uncoded message claiming its water distillation plant had broken down. It wasn't true, but it didn't need to be. 2 days later, Japanese encrypted traffic partially readable thanks to the new additive tables reported, "AF is short of water." There it was, the confirmation Nimitz needed. Absolute, undeniable. AF was Midway, and Japan was coming straight for it. In the code room, there was no cheering, just a heavy electric silence, the kind that follows a lightning strike. Margaret stared at the summary on the bulletin board, realizing the truth. A torn typewriter ribbon had just helped steer entire fleets. Once AF was confirmed as Midway, the code room became its own battlefield. Day and night blend together. Blackout curtains shut out the sun. Teletype machines rattled non-stop, spitting out new intercepts faster than anyone could read them. Stacks of paper leaned like unstable towers, trembling every time someone walked by. Rochefort's team rotated in 12-hour shifts, though nobody really slept. The master additive table, built from Margaret's repeating patterns, now covered half a wall, pinned under layers of tracing paper. Whenever a decoded fragment appeared, analysts shouted for others to hold that pattern, then rushed over to verify the math. Japan's fleet was already moving. Intercepts referenced Carrier Division 1. Then call the signs for Akagi, then for Kaga, then Soryu, then Hiryu. The same 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, now all converging toward Midway. The tempo inside Frupak spiked with every new scrap of translation. Main body rendezvous, landing force, attack at dawn. Pieces of a massive operation began sliding into place with frightening clarity. And in a corner of the room, Margaret typed those fragments into clean, crisp lines. Each keystroke felt heavier than the last one. She wasn't decoding, she wasn't analyzing, but she was watching raw numbers turn into warnings that would decide where American carriers sailed. On June the 3rd, Rochefort handed Nimitz a final distilled report. Enemy striking force for approximately 4 carriers will approach Midway from the northwest. Attack expected dawn of June the 4th. Nimitz read it once, then again, then simply said, "We'll be waiting for them." Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown turned toward a spot of ocean Japan believed was empty. Dawn broke on June the 4th with a message from Midway. "Many planes heading your way, bearing streetwear." They had come exactly when the codebreakers said they would. For Margaret, typing that update felt surreal. She wasn't on a flight deck, she wasn't in a cockpit. But she could feel the battle unfolding blow by blowing through the wires and numbers she had touched for weeks. Her torn ribbon had led to the trap. Now the trap was snapping shut. The Battle of Midway lasted only a few hours. But inside the Honolulu code room, it felt like the world held its breath. Margaret typed every incoming update with steady fingers. Hit on Akagi, fires on Kaga spreading, Soryu burning, Hiryu heavily damaged, 4 Japanese carriers gone. The same ones that had leveled Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. 3,000 Japanese sailors lost, Japan's naval air arm shattered beyond repair. And yet, there was no cheering. When the message arrived, confirming the 4th carrier's destruction, the entire room fell silent. No victory cries, no applause, just stunned stillness. Rochefort removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "It's over," he said softly. They walked right into it. Davis leaned toward Margaret. "Your ribbon did this." She only shook her head. "No, we all did." Later that afternoon, Nimitz sent a private thank you to the unit, but the victory itself was immediately classified. No one outside that building would know how it had really happened. Rochefort told his team the truth. "You can tell no one how we knew, not your family, not your friends, not anyone." The torn ribbon was locked in a safe marked operational evidence, "Do not remove." Margaret's notes were destroyed, reports credited improved reconnaissance and good fortune. In newspapers back home, Midway became a story of brave pilots and bold admirals. No mention of the basement. No mention of clerical staff. No mention of the woman who saw the pattern. That night, Honolulu erupted in celebration. Ships blasted horns. Sailors danced in the streets. People toasted about the turning point of the Pacific War. Inside the code room, the victory tasted different. It was quieter and smaller, almost all private, because the people who had seen the hidden war and won it weren't allowed to feel triumphant. They were only allowed to keep working. Japanese messages continued flowing in. The typewriters kept rattling. Margaret kept typing summaries into the night, her fingers stained with ink. For the first time in months, she stepped outside at dawn. The sky over the Pacific was soft grey. The air smelled of salt and rain. 4 carriers were gone. Japan's advance had been broken, and she, a woman no one noticed, had helped make it happen. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the code room went silent for the first time in 3 years. No teleprinter hum, no Morse tapping, no towers of intercepts waiting to be typed. Just quiet. For Margaret, that silence felt heavier than any battlefield report she had ever typed. She filed her last summary, signed a lifelong non-disclosure oath, packed her notebooks, and walked out of the building that had defined her entire world. No medal, no ceremony, not even a handshake. The war moved on, and it left her behind. Back in Chicago, she blended into civilian life without a ripple. She took a secretarial job at an insurance office for the same typing, the same precision, but without the weight of fleets riding on her keystrokes. Her co-workers assumed she'd been a clerk or a nurse during the war. She let them believe it. The truth sounded impossible anyway. Years slid by quietly. She married a gentleman, raised 2 children, kept an old Underwood typewriter key on her dresser as her only reminder of the life she couldn't talk about. Some nights, when the house was empty, she'd type meaningless numbers just to hear that familiar mechanical heartbeat, the one that once guided her through nights of war. Then came the movies, the documentaries, the books, all praising brilliant admirals, daring pilots, and the miracle of Midway. She watched them alone, whispering corrections under her breath. It wasn't lucky. It was ink. In 1982, long after her children were grown, a historian knocked on her door. He held a stack of declassified documents. He had tracked surviving members of the Honolulu Code Unit, and her name had surfaced. "Mrs. Howard," he said, "I think you helped win the Battle of Midway." She smiled softly. "I typed some numbers. That's all." She refused to be interviewed. She refused to be credited. She refused to let the spotlight distort a story that, for her, belonged to the entire room. She died in 1989, a quiet passing for a quiet woman. 3 years later, more files were released. Historians noticed pencil dots on surviving intercept copies of tiny marks beside repeated 5-digit groups. Her marks, a faded 1942 memo even acknowledged, observation by female clerical staff led to discovery of additive repetition. No name, no rank, no recognition, just a ghost. Print of her presence like the faint impressions on that torn typewriter ribbon. Today, that very ribbon, labeled Evidence No. 14, sits locked in a climate-controlled museum vault. Visitors walk past without knowing they're looking at one of the most important artifacts of the Pacific War. Because history remembers admirals, it remembers the battleships, the carriers, the men who gave the orders. But sometimes, the war is turned by someone no one ever sees. A woman in the corner of the room, a frayed ribbon, a pattern she refused to ignore, a small act of attention that changed the world. The Battle of Midway is remembered as dive bombers falling out of the sky, carriers burning on the horizon, and admirals making impossible choices in minutes. But that's only half of the story. The other half happened in a windowless room in Honolulu, in a war fought with pencils, paper, workout typewriters, and a torn ribbon that should have been thrown away. Margaret Howard never touched a flight deck, never launched a scout plane, never fired a weapon. But she did something just as powerful. She paid attention. She noticed the tiny flaw in a code Japan believed was perfect. She saw what everyone else missed. And because she did, American carriers sailed to the right ocean at the right hour on the right day and ambushed the most powerful naval strike force on Earth. She didn't get a medal. She didn't get her name on the paper. She didn't get invited to reunions where admirals told their stories. History almost erased her, but the Pacific didn't. The tide turned because of her ribbon. Midway was saved because of her insight. And the war, the great, sprawling, brutal war, shifted because a woman with no authority trusted what she saw and refused to ignore it. When people say Midway was won by luck, they're not wrong. But luck wasn't random. It had a name, a desk, a typewriter, and a faint trail of numbers, pressed into a torn strip of ink. This channel exists to bring those forgotten heroes back into the light, the ones history footnotes, the ones museums overlook, the ones who shaped the world quietly, anonymously, beautifully. If stories like this move you, if you believe history is bigger than headlines, make sure you're subscribed.